You know, I've met a group of very incredible people here today, and very interesting folks at the same time. And one of the things I picked up on during various conversations around this area here today is that folks seem very curious about how I had found my way to this particular point. And having worked with the Florida Department of Corrections for better than 23 years, I also worked for a county jail after I retired for almost a year down in Orlando. But I came to Florida in 1978 as a very modest retiree, 41 years old at that time, and I picked a place to live down in Homestead, Florida. I was a single man. I was a divorcee. My son was out of school at that point. I felt that I'd just live down there on my modest retirement and have a good time. Of course, in factoring my retirement, I left out a few very minor things like food and health insurance, and I very quickly learned that I had to find not only work, but work that provided things like health insurance. And a friend directed me to the local police department where they were starving for cops. And it was going to take about 6 months to get on there. And but he said they need guards down at the prison right now. So I drove on down there and found this place, and they were desperate. I got there at 10 o'clock in the morning, and by 10:30 they were trying to find me a used uniform. A guy took me down a dirt road behind the prison. It's right on the border of the Everglades. It's called Dayton Correctional Institution. And he gave me a loaded six-shooter, and I took a few shots at a 5-gallon can. He said, "You passed." And he said, "Now you got to get back home because I had a ponytail and a beard, and he said, you can't have that if you're going to work in the Florida Department of Corrections." I almost quit because I didn't want to cut either one off, and but I did, and I started out as an untrained correctional officer supervising the dormitory. I learned more from the inmates in the first few weeks than I did from the staff because they didn't have enough staff to teach me. I was a correctional officer for almost a year before they sent me to an academy, and they sent me up to Union Correctional Institution to get trained. I started seeing abuse that I couldn't believe. It was very early in my career. It was in that first year that I saw inmates beaten just for the fun of it, just because a goon squad didn't have much else to do, and they felt as though some inmate had made an inference or a reference or said a word or two that they didn't like. They were going to go down and pay him a visit after lights were out. So they would haul this fellow out of his cell and take him down a dark corner someplace, and they would drag him back to the cell. They learned from McAndrew very early in my career that I wasn't going that way. That if something like that was going to happen, I'd better not know about it, because I knew how to read and I knew how to write, and I probably wasn't the best trained correctional officer in Florida, but I knew how to file an incident report. And a lot of those incident reports got lost. We changed wardens. There was a warden that came along who actually cared. He sort of surprised me. He called me up after reading one of my incident reports. And that's what sort of really got me into the groove of wanting to be a correctional officer and wanting to be a real part of corrections in Florida. My career was accelerated. I moved all over the state of Florida. I worked at 8 different prisons, and I felt like I made something of a contribution at every level I worked. I was an officer, a sergeant, a lieutenant, a captain, an investigator, a major, an assistant warden, and finally I was appointed to a warden in 1991, I believe it was. I met some incredible people along the way. We talked about one of them this afternoon with a few of you folks who seem to know him, Dennis O'Neill. Dennis O'Neill is an Episcopal priest right now in Stark, Florida, and he is the past warden of Union Correctional Institution. He represents the same identical things that I do, and that's why we became such good friends when I first met him in the mid-'80s. Dennis is also speaking out against the death penalty all around the Florida area. I'm surprised that more of you don't know him. He's certainly been much more active than I have. We've discussed this subject many times, especially in the last couple of years. But the day came finally that I was assigned to Florida State Prison. I went there knowing that it was a hornet's nest. I knew that it was a place where inmates were treated brutally. I knew it was a place where practically everybody in the prison, if they weren't related, they were married to someone who was related to someone who was married to someone who was related to someone. They call it the Iron Triangle, and it involves 8 prisons in the Stark area of Florida, sometimes known as Rayford. Florida State Prison is actually in Rayford. Anything that happened there, you had to be on your tippy toes. So Ron McAndrew, who already has a reputation for not putting up with what they call kicking ass and taking names, came into town. And within days I was there. I hadn't been there 2 weeks. I fired an assistant warden. I started firing people who abused inmates. I fired a lieutenant for using the N-word, and they couldn't believe that I had actually fired him. They said, you could have given him a letter of supervisory counseling. I says, man, this is 1996 at the time. You know, I said, this isn't 1926. So within weeks, the first execution came along. I seem to know the first day that this happened, and standing there and going through that horrible affair, that I was standing in the wrong place. I had signed an agreement to go there. The Secretary of the Department of Corrections had asked me if I would in fact carry out the executions. I supported the death penalty. I thought it was the right thing to do. I said, yes, I will. But until you stood in that room, until you strapped a poor man into a chair, you put a wet sponge on top of his head and you sent him off into another world, and you've got to be there to know just how dirty and horrible it is. Dressing it up like they did in Texas, they sent me down there to learn how to do lethal injections after the Pedro Medina execution. And that's what they taught me when I got to Huntsville. They said, we've got 2 scheduled this week. One of them might get a stay, and I was there for the duration so I had to learn how to do it so I could take all this knowledge back to Florida, because it was apparent that we had a legislature that was going to move us over to lethal injection in lieu of the electric chair. But what I was taught during the 5 or 6 visits to Texas was how to dress it up and make it look pretty to the public. Got a chaplain here who really knows his stuff. He goes around and he coddles the man we're getting ready to kill, and he gets him all ready, slips him a little pill to make him feel comfortable. He goes out in front, talks to the television cameras. He makes everybody out there feel warm and fuzzy about he's not bothered by this. He's had his reckoning with God. He's ready to go. They make it look pretty. In the meantime, I'm walking back and forth in front of this guy's cell. I've been talking to him, various men during that period. They didn't look so comfortable to me. They didn't look like they were ready. And they were not ready. None of them were. But there again, the dressing was in the window, and it made it look pretty for the public. And they're still doing it. They're still doing it in Huntsville. They're going to still do it in Florida. They're going to still do it anywhere around this country. They'll have professionals behind the scene. They'll bring in media people from the capital of the state, highly trained individuals that know how to speak in front of the cameras. They'll bring in everything they have to. The governor will have his own personal representative or her representative there. They'll make it look real pretty, so that when you're asked, do you support the death penalty, you won't smell the burning flesh. You won't see them gouging and cutting and sticking needles all the way through a man's artery and wondering why it takes 34 minutes for him laying there begging to know what's happening.